Thank you so much for coming to the next edition of the Cyber Policy Center's weekly seminar. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Alex Stamos. I'm the director of the Stanford Internet Observatory here in Encino Hall. And it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague here, Ronald Robertson. Dr. Robertson joined us from his PhD program at Northeastern in network science, where he did work with both political scientists and computer scientists. And since getting here to SIO, we have really seen the benefit of that cross-disciplinary training that he's had. Ronald has the ability to get his fingers dirty in the lowest levels of code that we write, and is also able to synthesize theses and test his real kind of quantitative social science questions at the highest level. And we're really excited today for him to give you a preview of a paper that has been accepted to a top journal, and that'll be coming out shortly. There's a lot of, when you work in our area of kind of human-computer interaction and societal impact of big platforms, there's a lot of assumptions people make, a lot of kind of shibboleths and phrases people throw out there without empirical evidence, without quantitative study, without any real academic backing. And that's unfortunately very, very true in our field. Ronald is one of the real exceptions to that. And it's been wonderful to see him both with this paper and with previous work that he's done around YouTube, around Google, to bring a real methodology to answering these questions and to try to dispel some of the assumptions that we all just make about how large platforms impact people's understanding of the world. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ronald, and then we'll take questions at the end.
Yeah, so thank you, Alex, for that kind introduction. Also, shout out to David, Ben, and Michelle for making the seminar series happen. It's been great. I've learned a lot, and I hope you find this one interesting. Let's see if this work. Oh, look. There we go. Okay, so the title of this talk is Engagement Outweighs Exposure to Partisan and Unreliable News within Google Search. I'm obviously Ronald. This is joint work with John Green, Damian Ruck, Catherine Nakminova, Krista Wilson, and David Lazar. And this has really been a 5 or 6 year project now that has 2 study waves and involves a lot of data that really tries to get at what people both see and do when they're on online platforms. And that is kind of like a major contribution to this work. So with that, let's just jump in. The importance of online platforms and news is kind of obvious to this crowd. It's on the prevalence of partisan and unreliable news is a topic of ongoing concern among policymakers, civil society, organizations, and academics alike. Pretty much everybody is concerned about these things. They often center the role of online platforms like search engines or social media and how they kind of guide people to these types of news and what the societal impacts that guiding might incur. Oftentimes, this theoretical grounding, underlying these concerns, is really selective exposure, which is a long-standing thing from political science, which says that we'll choose stuff that's congruent with our existing beliefs, and in some ways avoid stuff that's not. In online settings, we often hear these phrases that jump into this selective exposure and gets framed as filter bubbles or echo chambers. Now, thinking about these things, the definitions for these vary a lot and overlap. And really, if you look through a lot of papers, sometimes they're not defined at all. And you see that in the media too. We talk about these things as if they're these really concrete concepts, but rarely do we get a definition that kind of helps us operationalize them and think about how to measure them. Both, though, predict a pretty similar observable outcome. It's that partisans will see and select a significant amount of identity congruent content. And both can also be described in terms of user choice and algorithmic curation. Let me explain that a little bit more. With echo chambers, they really center the role of users' choices and how they can create these settings in which most available information conforms to pre-existing attitudes and biases. So that means who you choose to follow on social media, what you click on, what kind of search queries you use, these things, your choices about what you do online can end up putting you in a situation where you see only information that agrees with your existing beliefs. And you can contrast this with filter bubbles, which really center the role of algorithmic curation and this kind of feedback loop in which an algorithm learns from your past behaviors what you like or what you believe and sort of starts showing you more and more of the same thing. So if you're on YouTube and you're looking at cat videos, it's going to show you more cat videos because it's learning from your past behavior. So these things aren't really well defined, but this user choice and algorithmic curation way of thinking about them kind of gives you a way to look at platform interactions, the interactions that people have with platforms from these two angles. And so you can think of a platform interaction as user choice, and we can think of this or measure it as engagement or what people do online. And then you can think of what the platform shows them as the algorithmic curation part of things. So this is exposure, what the platform is exposing people to. So with engagement as a measure of user choice, people in digital trace studies, as they're often called in computational social science and related fields, often look at a log of what sites people visit and the time that they visit them. And this is sort of the extent of the data that they look at in many studies. You just see this like kind of linear path of somebody's behavior on the web. And that's all you really get. But really, you're missing what they're actually seeing when they're on these sites, which is what we're going to call exposure here. So when you're at a URL at a given timestamp, that's not like the end of the story, right? That person that is at that URL is actually looking at something on the screen. And most measures don't encompass this because it's just a measure of engagement, like a browser history log, as you might have if you use Firefox or Chrome. So it's important to measure both of these things, but it's kind of hard to do with real people. Most of the time when we measure exposure in past work is through something that's known as algorithm auditing, which is basically this method where you have a controlled set of inputs that you send to some platform and you get back the outputs from that. So a page of search results, you might come up with a list of queries, send them to a search engine and get back a bunch of pages of search results. But the problem with that, it's a really good measure, a really good way to look at kind of the landscape of what a platform does given a controlled set of inputs. But the problem is also the strength because the control that you get over the inputs lacks ecological validity, right? You have to choose the queries that you're going to send to the search engine, and that might not reflect what somebody would actually choose to use as a query. So at best, in the past, we often end up looking at hypothetical exposure. Really is what somebody might have seen had they chosen this query that I selected and sent at the time that I sent it. So in the context of search, which is the focus of this paper, what we're going to do is we're going to look at when somebody goes to a search engine, they engage with the search engine, give it a query. The search engine exposes them to a page of search results that has a bunch of links in it. And subsequently, they go to another URL, which, depending on some rules that you can set, like a time threshold from when they conducted the search to the next page they visited, you can attribute as a follow, that's what we're going to call it, from the page of search results. So they're exposed to a page of search results, and then they follow something after that. So why focus on Google search? Well, a lot of work on partisan and unreliable news is focused really on social media platforms and general web browsing, partly because these data sets are easier to get, but web search is arguably more important. According to some surveys, it's the second most common use of the internet. And if you think about how often you search per day, that might turn out to be true. It also plays a central role in directing people to news. Depending on the study you look at, it is on par with social media or exceeds social media in terms of the amount of news traffic it sends to news domains. And it's also widely trusted and used sometimes to check the accuracy of information found on other parts of the web. In some surveys, people have found that people will fact check the stuff they see on social media by plugging in words that they see in that post into a search engine and going to see if that's true or not. And finally, some work I conducted a long time ago in a lab suggests that if you politically bias search rankings to favor one political candidate or another, this actually has a measurable impact on the political opinions. And I'm not actually aware of any similar work on social media, even though it receives the majority of attention for concerns related to this. Among search engines, we focus on Google search because it controls like the majority of the search engine market, both in the US and worldwide. To date, studies involving ecologically valid exposure or engagement data meaning, what real people saw or did on the web, has really been limited to a few internal studies published by social media platforms, which we might not see many more of, given the current state of things. Okay, so for this project, the way we design this is the way a lot of studies are now being designed, which is that we have a survey and we have these demographic and political and media usage questions. And then we're going to pair that to a browser extension that we built. And it's going to collect some engagement data in the form of browser history. So this is what you would see if you go to your history in Chrome or Firefox, just a log of the websites that you visited and the time that you visited them. We're going to measure exposure using a technique from algorithm auditing, which basically involves grabbing the full HTML, like a whole copy of the page, when somebody visits Google search. And so that way we can post hoc parse that page, extract the links, and see what they were seeing at that time. And for follows, to attribute, an exposure and an engagement, we're going to use people's Google history, which is the page you can see if you're on your Google account. You go to the My Activity page, kind of is a log of what you clicked on search pages, and tab activity, which is a measure that I developed in 2020, kind of learning from the previous iteration of the study. And we're going to do this study in two waves, kind of the same exact study. In 2018, around the US midterm elections for a period of about 3 months, and with participants recruited through YouGov, kind of a small sample size, about 300 people, depending on which data set we're talking about. And then we're going to do it again in 2020 during the US presidential elections for a longer time window, and through a different survey vendor, again, Pure Spectrum in this case, and a slightly bigger sample size, about 600, again, depending on which data set you're thinking of. And for each of these data sets, what we're going to do is a domain level analysis. So, like bbc.com, not like the full URL, of news. And we're going to define that using a compendium of existing lists, unreliable news defined using a couple lists from past work, and partisan news using these scores that I also developed in my prior work. So to talk a little bit more about these metrics, because they're so central to our study, for news, we have a list of about 12,000 domains that we can classify as news based on 4 previous data sets. There's about 488 hard news from this Bakshay et al. Study, about 1,200 from another study, 6,300 from a data set of local news websites created by Leon Yin, markup, and 6,100 sites identified as news by NewsGuard, which is an organization that employs journalists and editors to look at news sites and rate them. For unreliable news, we have a list of about 3,000 domains, and we classify these based on whether they appear in 2 lists. One is a bigger list, about 2,500 domains, again from NewsGuard, which is sort of what I just said, but they give us websites a score from 0 to 100 based on reliability, and they have this suggested cutoff of 60, which we are going to use to determine unreliable or reliable. And we're also going to use this other list, which slightly overlaps, of 490 domains from Grinberg et al., who did a study of fake news on Twitter in 2019. And they really looked at kind of like the editorial processes of the domains that were producing these stories and used that to establish their classifications. Okay, so we've got news and unreliable news. And for partisan news, what we're going to do is use these scores from my prior work, which are really audience scores. And we want to be able to place a domain on this spectrum from left to right, where Democrats are on the left, Republicans are on the right. And the way that we're going to do this, well, the way that I did it in the past is we got about 19,000 scores for these domains, about 2,500 news domains. And we did this by linking a lot of Twitter accounts, about 500,000, to US voter registration records by the following approach, which is searching the registered voter's name on Twitter. If we found an account that matched, we checked for a location match. And then if the name and the location matched, then we linked those records and we said that this is this person on Twitter. And if there were multiple matches, we just were conservative about it and discarded that match. And in total, from these accounts, we collected about 113 million tweets that had a URL. And so now we know the these are Democratic Twitter accounts, these are Republican Twitter accounts, and these are the URLs that they retweeted. And so using that, what you can do is calculate a bias score for each domain based on the relative proportion of Democrats or Republicans sharing it. So there's a couple examples. MSNBC, which is obviously a left-leaning outlet, you might get something like 1 out of 6 Republicans sharing it, more Democrats sharing it. You subtract this proportion, and then you divide by some of those proportions, and you end up getting the score from -1 to 1. In this case, it's -6, -0.6, which indicates a left-leaning domain, right? And that kind of checks out face validity-wise with what we would expect the score of MSNBC to be. Then we could do the same thing for Fox News. And this is actually real in the data. It ends up being pretty much the mirror opposite of that, which is good, right? In terms of face validity, that checks out. And I put this example in here because it helps highlight what these scores are used for. A lot of surveys find that Democrats and Republicans equally trust the Wall Street Journal as a source of news. And indeed, when we calculate these scores, the score for the Wall Street Journal is close to 0. But by design, these scores aren't useful for absolute comparisons, just relative ones. We can say that this is to the left of that, or this is to the right of that. And a score of 0 doesn't mean that it's politically neutral in any sense of that word at all. It just means that an equal number of Democrats and Republicans in this virtual Twitter panel shared that domain in the time period that we looked at. And so we have these scores for each domain. And when we have a page of search results to kind of flatten that down into one single score, we also use a rank weighted average from that paper, which basically weights news domains appearing at the top of the rankings higher than those appearing at the bottom to account for the way that people browse search results, which is from top to bottom. And most attention goes to the results that appear at the top. So we want to weight those a little heavier. And that's what we do here. So now that we have these 3 different data sets and we have our 2 measures, we can actually look at what this looks like, with ecological data and what people actually see and do with these scores. So I've blocked these out for now, but these rows are the years. On the y-axis, we have the different data sets. On the x-axis on the left is average news partisanship. We're calculating that at the individual level and then clustering it by these groups, strong Democrat, independent, strong Republican. So in the top left, what we get when we look at average news partisanship is something like this. So it's kind of got this fanning out shape. And we can see really with Google search exposure, what people saw when they were on Google search throughout our study period. There's not that many differences between strong Democrats and strong Republicans. There are some, these are sort of significant. If you look at a Kruskal-Wallis test of these different scores in that data set. But the gap, the partisan gap between strong Democrats and strong Republicans gets a lot bigger when you go from looking at what people saw to what people actually clicked on those results, the follows. And then it gets even bigger when you look at overall engagement. So as you look at, algorithmic curation, what they're seeing on Google versus what they click on Google versus what they click overall, you see greater partisan gaps. So it's more like not so much that Google search is pigeonholing people into filter bubbles, but people sort of self-select into these echo chambers sort of things based on the choices that they make, both on the platform and off the platform. And in 2020, we find almost the exact same thing. It's a little bit different, but in essence, the idea is the same. As you look at things that involve more user choice, their follows and their overall engagement, you get a bigger partisan gap and greater differences between strong Democrats and strong Republicans. So now if you look at unreliable news, we can look at the average proportion of unreliable news that people looked at in each of these data sets. And so for Google search exposure, what people were seeing, we see relatively comparable levels, but strong Republicans are kind of taking off there, especially in overall engagement. And this is actually really consistent with a lot of work that's looked at partisan and unreliable news in social media. We often find this asymmetry where Republicans end up looking at and clicking on more unreliable news sites than Democrats do. In 2020, again, sort of mirroring the thing that we found with partisanship, we find the same sort of pattern. as you go down and you get more user choice involved in the data set, from what people saw to what people clicked on, to what people click on in general, you get greater separation, especially with strong Republicans sort of composing most of that difference. It's also interesting to kind of think about like the intersection of these two data sets in terms of what people do. So like, what is the relationship between an individual's average news partisanship and the amount of unreliable news that they look at? And so we can look at that here. The y-axis is the log of the proportion of the unreliable news that they looked at. And along these x-axes is, again, average news partisanship. So it's kind of similar to the previous one, except we're just like flopping it kind of cross tab. So if we look up here in 2018 at Google search exposure, what people saw, we see this kind of tightly clustered thing. There's not really any relationship there between the amount of partisan news that people see and the amount of unreliable news that people see. In 2020, it's basically the same thing, just kind of this blob. And when we look at Google search follows, we get a little more variance. We start to see a little bit more separation between these two groups. Sort of a similar thing in 2020, though there's a lot more zeros. And then when we get to overall engagement, there's like a much different story where these things start to separate in a much clearer way. And this is sort of very similar in 2020. And there's sort of like a Simpsons paradox thing going on here, if you know what I mean, which is basically that if you look at the group and you try to draw a correlation line between these two, it's not significant. It doesn't exist. But if you break it out and you look at the individual groups, if you look at strong Republicans and strong Democrats and you draw that correlation separately, then you get a negative correlation for Democrats and a positive correlation for Republicans, which means that strong Democrats who look at more left-leaning news also look at more unreliable news. And same is true for strong Republicans who look at more right-leaning news. They also see more unreliable news. So it's always something to look out for in your data sets. So that's that. And of course, you know, descriptive results and correlations are great, but really we want to control for a lot of other factors that we know are going to play a role, like people's age, how much news they like to consume, and gender and race, just as standard demographic variables. And so in each of these plots, what we're going to look at is two models of average news partisanship, one in which we're including everybody's demographics, the ones I just mentioned, and then one model where we're going to look at their demographics plus a measure of their search queries, which we use pivoted text scaling to do. It's this kind of principal components analysis sort of method using a co-occurrence word matrix. And it gives you these like dimensions along which queries vary. And it's nice because a lot of text models require a substantial amount of text, and queries tend to be 3 to 4 words short in length. And so you need kind of a different model to look at those. And so looking at this when we're controlling for all these different factors and comparing to independents, we find no differences between strong Democrats and strong Republicans in terms of what they see on Google. So they're conducting these searches, and Google is not showing strong Democrats or strong Republicans significantly different results, news results, than they show independents. There's no result. But when we look at follows, so this is again what people are clicking on those Google search pages, we again see this kind of asymmetric effect where strong Republicans are clicking on more partisan news, right-leaning partisan news, than independents do, but strong Democrats are not. And then again, kind of that fanning out shape appearing again for overall engagement, everything people click on the news, all news clicks on the web. We see again the separation where strong Democrats click on more left-leaning news than independents, and strong Republicans click on more right-leaning news than independents. So again, it's kind of, when you look at algorithmic curation in this first thing, what Google search is showing them, there's not much of an effect. There's not much of a difference. And we look at this again in 2020, and we find basically the same thing, where strong Republicans kind of branch out and look at more unreliable news, partisan news, whereas strong Democrats do not. I don't have a graph for this, but looking at this, these regression results, the same types of models for unreliable news, there's no effects for either exposure or follows. But again, we find these asymmetric effects for strong Republicans and overall engagement, but not strong Democrats. So what does it all mean? Some of the most widely discussed and debated concerns about online ecosystem are rarely defined in concrete and measurable terms, such as echo chambers, filter bubbles, and rabbit holes. We've tried to do that here. Understanding how online platforms contribute to these problems really requires measuring both sides of these interactions with users, not just what users do on them, which is what the majority of work has looked at so far, but you also have to look at what the platform shows them so that you can compare the two and sort of understand how one might lead to the other or might not. And using this measurement framework, we find limited evidence really that Google Search's algorithmic curation pushes people into political filter bubbles, but substantial evidence that people self-select into echo chambers, which follows that distinction between these two that I drew earlier. Of course, there's a lot of limitations to any work like this. First and foremost, relying on domain level metrics misses a ton of nuance in terms of the URL level things that are happening. So, the Fox News can produce an article that somebody might read and really think is left-leaning. MSNBC might produce news that you could consider right-leaning. Domains in our data set that were coded as unreliable might produce reliable news, maybe half the time. And sites that are coded as reliable might produce unreliable news, like, I don't know, for example, the New York Times. Another problem that's kind of inherent to any study like this is that you have to have participants install a browser extension. And so you end up with a small sample that's kind of quirky in a way because it's like a surveillance device installed on your computer. Nevertheless, we did these two waves and we saw pretty much the exact same thing in both of them. And the differences between these two samples that we used are actually like a strength of the study because they had different survey vendors. They had different sampling procedures. We oversampled in 2018 to kind of get more statistical leverage between these groups we wanted to compare. And they were conducted during different election periods, substantial sociopolitical context differences. And there were slightly different data collection approaches that are just due to practical matters. And nevertheless, besides all these differences, we find pretty much the same pattern, which is sort of remarkable in a lot of ways. So to wrap things up, study provides an ecologically valid look at exposure engagement in Google Search. It advances methods for collecting such data on any platform. You could use this to study Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, and demonstrates really the importance of measuring both these angles when you're looking at online platforms. However, our findings do not imply that the design of Google Search's algorithms are normatively unproblematic. We looked at these like participant level averages and group level averages, but in some cases, Google does return unreliable news or sort of hyper partisan news domains. And that's cause for concern because, it's unclear how many exposures you need for something to have a negative impact on you. And there is at least qualitative evidence that a small number of exposures to such information can have pretty dramatic effects, really tragic effects in the real world. It's also important to mention that we're looking specifically at political news and like political information, whereas Google's search algorithms deliver information of all sorts. In separate work I did, we looked at how they respond to abortion-related keywords, and we found some troubling results there. So this doesn't like exonerate in any sense, and there's a lot more to look into. Moreover, determining the circumstances under which you might show or omit news sources like this in web search is a complex, evolving, sometimes adversarial challenge that requires significant social context and subject matter expertise. As if you recently bought a social media company and fired those teams, you're quickly figuring out. So as data sharing agreements between academia remain limited and really unstable in a lot of ways, our approach for collecting data directly from real users may provide a useful avenue towards independent assessments of any platform. And we'll be sharing our code and everything that we use to develop these, and hope that they get used. With that, it's the end of the talk. Thank you very much for being here and listening. Appreciate it.
So I've got a couple of initial questions, Ron. So first, so you had a version of the analysis where you controlled for the search terms.
Yeah.
How does this interact? Because at the timing you're talking about here, 2018, 2020, we saw a lot less of, well, we've seen since then a growth in the do your own research kind of adversarial search terms, right? That people will throw out, oh, you want to learn about COVID, do your own research, and then they'll give search terms where they know those terms have been intentionally poisoned through SEO.
Right.
Is this at all applicable to kind of how in the 2022, especially with specific subgroups such as anti-vax? What does that teach you? What does this work teach you? And what future work would you do around that?
Yeah, it's an interesting point about kind of these queries that lead people to certain searches. I've actually been looking into this in recent work. We call these search directives. So you often see this in social media. And honestly, now that I've told you about it, you're probably going to see it everywhere because I do. People will tell you to Google this, Google that, search this, search that. Sometimes they give you the exact search terms you need to use. Sometimes it's kind of a combobulation of like words that you might or might not use. Our work is sort of limited in what we can say about the exact queries that people use. We were able to look at different dimensions in this unsupervised method, which is sort of one of the few methods that's available for really short pieces of text. And the thing about our study, and sort of something that we need in the future, is the ability to kind of compare across time periods, right? Because as you said, this sort of trend has picked up a lot in recent years, but with our two samples, and I hope I was careful about this in the presentation, we are not comparing across years because it's two different samples collected very different ways. Again, that's kind of the strength of the study because the results are consistent. But we can't really say that like, you know, any of the changes that we saw from 2018 to 2020 were due to anything really. All we can say is that they're pretty consistent. We can't draw an inference about.
Right. So, because I was going to ask, it seemed like there was an improvement in the gap between Democrats and Republicans, and so you would not call that a scientific gap.
I would caution them out.
You caution from me drawing that conclusion. Okay, great. Look at me, I just gave a speech on having empirical evidence for your conclusions. And then another question is, coming out of this, how stateless is Google search from, you know, because you have this initial results might be pretty neutral, and then people follow. The follows are quite different, right? In both those years, you found that people self-select. How often does Google take into that into account of the, you know, how much does it remember what you've clicked on as to give you search results in the future? And does that change, do you think, what your results would be for something that is very explicitly stateful search like YouTube?
Yeah. So that's something I thought a lot about because the filter bubble really, we're looking at it at this like, you know, one snapshot sort of like in aggregate. And really, I think that the filter bubble is more over time thing. Like you slowly get further and further into this thing and the algorithm shows you more of it and you click on more of it. You sort of get deeper into it, at least that's a conventional wisdom around it. And that's not really what we looked at. But in the previous work that I've done, where we had these sort of controlled algorithm audits, where we looked at personalization on Google, what we ended up finding is that there really isn't that much personalization. And of course, you know, that's excluding what people call localization, which I think is fair to kind of tease apart because localization is about where you are, right? If I'm in Boston and I search for pizza, the results should be about pizza in Boston. That's like what we come to expect, and it would sort of be useless if it wasn't that way. You'd have to tag the city you're in onto every search query that you do. It's location relevant. So because Google doesn't really do that much personalization based on, you know, your browser history or your past behavior, I think that the way that we did this study actually has a pretty strong conclusion because there's not that much personalization, so we shouldn't expect kind of like an effect change over time, I guess. Although Google, of course, does a ton of updates every year, and that could change. And in terms of other platforms, I think that that's a whole different story, kind of, because in those cases, like in YouTube, I think a supply and demand framework is a little bit more relevant because YouTube actually provides the supply, they host the videos, and they have some control over that in some sense. Whereas Google has control over the websites that it indexes, but it doesn't own the web, right? Like the supply is really the web. And so it's hard to kind of think about it in that framework. I think it varies from platform to platform. And of course, you know, all the affordances that you see on a different search page, like YouTube, is substantially different from what you see in the page of search results for Google.
How important is the first result page? Like anecdotally, how often would people actually click on something outside of the top results?
I mean, empirically, I think the estimates range from 90% of clicks to like 70% of clicks going to the first page of search results alone, and maybe 20 or 30% going to the first result top. So there is a lot of like an extreme amount of power of being at the top result, which is why there's a multi-billion-dollar SEO industry built around doing exactly that.
Great. If anybody has any questions, please throw up their hand.
Ronald, thank you so much for the presentation. I just wanted to know if the study also saw how much ranking changed according to the Democrat looking at the search results. Is it different? Like which goes first?
Yeah, so we did not look at that. This is again one of the challenges of using real search data, is that trying to find two people that search the same thing or roughly the same thing at exactly the same time is hard to do. And even if it's a day apart, due to the rapid news cycles, you should expect it to change quite a bit. And so we didn't look at that. However, we did, control for rankings in our scoring to partisan news by using that rank weighted metric that I mentioned earlier. So that helps account for it a little bit, and like kind of that ends up in the final product that we look at. But we did not try to like match, this query at this time from a Republican and a Democrat. But that would be an interesting thing to do if you had a much bigger sample.
Hi, I was wondering, the field that I work in is online harassment, and I have seen the weaponization. I'm using this very specific word, the weaponization of Google search, especially in your second category, which is being suggested links that come afterwards. In particular, from contexts such as what is related to technical right, as well as LGBTIQ. And I would be interested to know if in the pool of information that you saw, you witnessed this type of, say I'm looking for anything regarding Roe versus Wade, and the links that are suggested to me are from hardcore, extreme evangelical conversion therapy.
Yeah, that's interesting. So do you mean like just in the general links, or do you mean in the search results? Yeah. So we didn't look at that specifically in this work, but in the abortion search paper that I mentioned, where we looked at abortion-related keywords across the US, kind of placing them in different locations, mainly trying to see if there's differences in different locations. What we found is that Google sometimes frequently would return these things known as CPCs, or crisis pregnancy centers, which pretty much align with what you were saying. And sometimes in a couple cases, they had self-labeled themselves as abortion centers, which is really not great. And I think a lot of that has been corrected. Hopefully my paper had an impact on that. I don't know. But I think that there's a huge number of things to look at in terms of like what Google search is showing people and how that might be fixed. But I think that each one of those studies, you kind of need to pair with experts in that area to sort of look at these things and understand like, what to actually look for. Like I wouldn't try to take that study on without, say, you as a collaborator. But yeah, there's just so many things to look at, abortion, health, law, everything.
Is the data set you gathered useful in those circumstances? Could you reuse it? Because it is for just people using it all day. It wasn't they weren't particularly prompted to look for political topics.
There's no prompting. So yeah, in essence, you could use the same data set, and if you had a way of identifying the queries that people were using that were related to this or that, health, abortion, law, you could look at the real results that they actually were shown for those searches.
You guys didn't censor that or do any privacy masking of certain search terms and such?
No, I mean, it's kind of hard to do, right? Like if somebody searches their own address, like,
Right, which is the classic problem of trying to get data from these companies, is that you find that anonymized search, you can figure out, we're all like, nobody in here is Googled for themselves today, I'm sure, with their personal name, right? But yes, there are other people who perhaps might be interested in that kind of stuff. Yeah.
But we did, just to say, we did very strongly limit access. It was a separate machine. All the data was collected in that.
Right.
We're very, very careful about that.
But in that data set still exists. So there might be the opportunity for future research.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing to look at. So the parser that I built to kind of take the HTML that we collected and sort of strip out like all the links also delineates by type. We didn't look at that in this paper, but again, like maybe this data set could be useful in the sense that you'd be able to go back and look at the ads that people were shown and see if that was significantly different than sort of the organic results that they get shown, especially because, as you say, they appear at the top of the page. And I kept screenshots of this. I don't know if anyone else has ever done this, but over time, the ad thing has gotten like less and less noticeable. It was like a big yellow thing at once, and then it was kind of like a gray box, and now it's just like a gray, like light ad, which I imagine has a big effect. It's a lot of financial incentives for them. But that'd be cool to look at.
Right. So your data set would have that because you have the full HTML grab.
Yeah.
And the clicks. So
Yeah.
you would have like a Google Tag Manager or something. I forget exactly what the domain is, but the domain that they click on.
Yeah, we would go
Google Ad Services. You could pull that out.
We should go.
How about the box on the right? I forget what they call that.
Yeah, sometimes knowledge panel, sometimes something
Yeah.
else. Yeah, that's another really interesting thing to look at because eye-gazing studies show that people mainly look in like the top left, but that thing is there, and it does sometimes have information that, like beyond links, it's just like a summary of the thing that you're looking for. And that's sort of their goal with these things, right? And knowledge box on the side or the knowledge box at the top, it's sort of to give you an answer without you having to click on any results.
Right.
And so we didn't look at that, and you might need like a text model of some sort to kind of assess that.
Which seems like semi-curated, that side.
Yeah.
I mean, did you consider, because you guys are grabbing the links, you didn't consider doing like mouse over data and such, like hooking the JavaScript so you could see exactly where they've moused over? So they think about for the future.
Yeah.
Cool. So some questions that we got online. Are the lists of partisan and unreliable news sources available? And the answer is yes, because you got those from elsewhere.
So yeah, the partisan news sources are from a previous paper that was published at CSCW 2018. So those are available online. Also on my GitHub username is getronald. Look it up. And the NewsGuard scores are not available, unfortunately, because it's a proprietary thing, and we can't share that. You sort of have to go to them to do it. Super unfortunate. But we are sharing the rest of the things that we can. So the other unreliable news and the other news classifications.
So, one of the things you touched upon, but what do you see as the future of transparency from companies on this? I mean, it seems to me, unfortunately, everything's pointing the other direction from a privacy law perspective, from the actions of specific billionaires who are buying platforms and shutting down transparency. What do you see as the future of the potential of working directly with a Google or somebody like that on this?
I mean, I'm sort of optimistic. I think that all these platforms sort of at the moment have an opportunity to be like the leader in that space. And you have a lot of academics who basically want to provide you free labor to figure these problems out for you. And really, it's just a matter of like them sharing the data in a way that's secure, right? Like, I know what we were saying earlier about search, like the AOL fiasco,
Right,
forever ago. And they're all like kind of scared by that, probably rightfully so. Nobody wants their search data out there.
why don't you talk, in case people don't know about the AOL mess up?
Right. So was it 2009?
Something like that.
Something like this. AOL released a lot of search records. They anonymized them, and like a day or something later.
Well, they didn't anonymize. What they did was they created pseudo-anonymous IDs tied to a user's cookie, and so you could see that this pseudo-anonymous ID did all of these searches.
Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, you could tease apart like the individual's search records, and somebody really quickly like figured out somebody's address or something, and, like, figured out who they were.
Right, because you could find somebody searching for themselves, and then their porn search 7 down because you could see it's the same person. And there's a bunch of embarrassing stuff. I mean, there's a whole history of those data sets. There's the New York City taxi data set where you can figure out what affairs people were having by like looking at it's anonymized, but it's from somebody's house to somebody else's house, only at the same time every night, right? But this has also led to the creation of real study in differential privacy and people kind of having mathematical models of, can you anonymize these data sets in a way that is mathematically provably has some level of privacy protection?
Yeah, I guess the thing that concerns me about that, or not really concerns me, but it's like a thing to think about, is that in all these studies, ours included, I didn't show this result here, but on the internet, it's all heavy tails all the way down.
Yeah.
And so like a very small number of people account for the vast majority of this behavior, and the vast majority of that behavior, looking at unreliable news, looking at extremist things, whatever, is like a really small percent of the total. And so sometimes I wonder, like, if you throw this differential privacy thing and you add this noise to it,
right?
If you sort of lose that, you lose the heavy tail.
Right.
And so I wonder if you really just need to
the
have
one
like,
school shooter,
right,
who got radicalized through search results or YouTube or Discord or whatever,
Yep.
that they disappear the noise because it turns out one person has a massive disproportionate impact.
Exactly.
Were there other questions in the room?
Could you talk a little bit about what you know from your own studies about the cycle of Google policy making? When a researcher or a team produces a report, do you then see staff power dedicated to that? Can you see changes? Can you kind of changes in the policy of the platform?
If I could, I'd put it on my resume. But I mean, I definitely can't tell what they're doing internally. But there's a ton of anecdotal evidence that, when something pops up on Twitter, like somebody screen grabs a particularly egregious set of search results that has, I don't know, it was like the Las Vegas shooting, I think, had 4chan in the news box. And they very quickly like stamp that out right away. So I think that they are listening in some sense and responding very quickly. Whether or not that's like kind of a whack-a-mole thing that they're doing is unclear. And again, like I hope in the future that they could be more transparent about that and like sort of open it up, and people can write papers about that, because a lot of people would love to do that.
Question about where you divide the political bias for the domain name in the Twitter data. There's the whole like reviews does not necessarily mean endorsements.
Yep.
Like I recently saw a study on state sponsored political interference, and the region the election where they found that almost all the Chinese critical marketing art.
Yeah, I think that like irony and sarcasm are still unsolved NLP problems, largely. Hard to do. However, I know that people at Northeastern, where that Twitter panel still exists and has grown a lot, I think it's up to like 1 million users now tied to registration records. They're now working on a paper that looks at URL level things. And there's a really interesting like distributions when you look at a given domain and all the URLs that they have. And sometimes you get this sort of bimodal thing, which is what you're talking about. They share or people like agree with a lot of their URLs and share them that way. And this shows up as, Democrats retweeting MSNBC. And then you get this other little distribution bump, which is like Republicans sharing the same URLs, but hate sharing it. Exactly. And actually an interesting one that turns up, I forget if in my data set or another one, but there was like a Stormfront kind of website that had a left-leaning score. And it was because Democrats were calling it out as like, I can't believe, like, look at this website. How does it exist? Rightfully so, but caveats, struggles of scale.
I'm wondering if your research also looks at how the local and smaller media organizations are completely marginalized and criticized by the research. And often I want to search out maybe Russia, China, Philippines, and then we were not even really good at that to be on place. And it's more likely that I'll find a more deeper and in-depth coverage in local smaller.
Yeah, from like local. So we didn't look at kind of difference between, let's say, national and local news. But there is a paper by, I forget the author's name, it's in Nature Human Behavior, but it looks at using an algorithm modeling method, the differences in Google search's treatment of local and national news. And I'm pretty sure that their main finding takeaway was that there is a bias towards mainstream and national sources on Google search, so which is as you suspected.
Which I think, I expect that any news integrity initiative drives you naturally that direction, right? So if you've been criticized for highlighting fake news, I've seen this on the inside, then you end up saying, okay, we're going to push good news. And that naturally coordinates to well-known established brands that, you know, the Wall Street Journal and such, that maybe have a partisan bent that are seen as, and then things that are newer or more local and for which you don't have as much data is much harder, especially if it's not in your native, if you're working in the integrity team in the US and you're trying to judge, you know, news outlets in the Philippines, that must be much harder. And you're terrified of highlighting somebody who turns out to be
Malaysian teenager.
Yeah. We had a question online. Have you considered looking at other measures of political beliefs that aren't based upon identification of political party? For example, some online research focuses on anti-establishment sentiment, broader psychological traits, etc.
Yeah, I mean, tying into the thread about anti-democratic sentiment, we didn't show this here, but in the paper, we looked at all 7 political identities, sort of on a scale of strong Republican to strong Democrat. So there's like in between that, there's not very strong and lean. And it turns out that the lean Republicans also have like a very strong rightward pull, both in their search results and in what they click on. So I think it is important to consider other dimensions of like, you know, is partisan identity really like the strongest factor to think about when you're thinking about things like filter bubbles and echo chambers? And those data points that we saw suggest that maybe not, because sometimes, you know, people who identify as leaning one way or another, but not fully, you know, Republican or Democrat, actually have stronger opinions than people that do identify as strong Democrats.
Right. I mean, we've seen this in COVID, for example, of Democrat Republican is almost useless of determining about whether you're going to be open to certain conspiracy theories and such.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for your time, Ronald. Thank you for coming.